I was born in Los Angeles, but to quote a William Saroyan title, sometimes I feel like my heart is in the highlands. My paternal grandparents are from Kesab, Syria, and they're both genocide survivors, my grandmother in particular. My maternal grandparents also are genocide survivors, Aram Dede and Nirui Nene. My maternal grandfather, Aram, is actually from the same village as Dr Hovannisian's father. So we have fond recollections and family memories, if you will. I heard my grandparents' stories when I was growing up, and many people did not speak about their horrific experiences during the deportations and the genocide. What they saw, their parents being killed or dying on the marches, their family being separated. Many people didn't hear those stories. I heard them in bits and pieces, and they were very sad, but I was very young and I didn't quite understand the ramifications. When I went to Ferahian High School, is when I really began understanding more about it, because coincidentally, another coincidence, Salpi Ghazarian was at the time very active at Ferahian School, and one day we piled into Sarkis Ghazarian's van and we went to Thousand Oaks to meet filmmaker J. Michael Hagopian. That was Salpi who took us. And that sort of started my odyssey in terms of interviewing genocide survivors. I was very interested in the history and also fascinated at the whole way of capturing a story and the necessity of capturing a story on film. J. Michael Hagopian, whose collection is here with the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, conducted pre-interviews with genocide survivors. Film being very expensive, what he needed to do and wanted to do was basically to record the memory of the actual deportation and the march or whatever happened during the deportation. And so his interviews were very tight. They did not run on for hours and hours. They were for 15, 20 minutes, and they focused on the genocidal period of the survivor or the eyewitness's life. And so that was a very focused interview, if you will. What I learned when I went to UCLA and I signed up for Professor Hovannisian's oral history class was a whole different aspect to interviewing, and that is to capture ethnographic and cultural data that would be lost very quickly. And it was thanks to Professor Hovannisian, who pioneered a questionnaire which he gave to us students. We reviewed the questionnaire, we talked about it, he instructed us on how to utilize the questionnaire so that we were actually capturing more than just the genocide period of a genocide survivor's life. We were finding out what they ate, we were finding out how they lived, how their parents made a living or how their father made a living. They sang songs to us, they recited prayers, and all kinds of other delicious details that, again, would be lost had it not been for Professor Hovannisian's vision to think about capturing a life that no longer was, because the Armenians had not only been deported, but were literally no longer living in the lands in which they had grown up. So I credit to Professor Hovannisian for that. He trained me, and he trained many other students. And not only did he train us, but he also taught us something that was very important. He taught us that beyond being like robots, if you will, and following a questionnaire, to have some compassion and some pathos for the people who had undergone these horrific events, and not rush them in terms of trying to complete the questionnaire and getting all the questions answered, but to allow them the time to live these stories, because in a way it was very cathartic for many of them. They knew they were being recorded, and so they knew that what was happening was something that was very, very important. So they were really being very thorough in terms of answering our questions. And so we were taught to, you know, live the stories with them and let them take their time to tell their stories. And we got a lot of many great, again, ethnographic and cultural data from these eyewitness survivors. Fast forward to, I graduated from college, I got a degree in journalism where I learned to hone my interview skills, and then somehow, and I'm not sure quite how, it might have been again Salpi Ghazarian, Zorian got to me, the Zorian Institute, and they put me to work. They had me do some interviews as well. Their questionnaire was even more expanded than Professor Hovannisian's. It was pages and pages long. I had one interview that was about 4 hours, and we had to take a break, and it was an older man. It was Mr. Kerinian. I don't know if any of you know Haigush Kerinian Kohler, but it was her father. And after the interview, he went and he had a little room off of the kitchen, and he went and laid down, and I was very concerned about him. So I went to the door and I asked him if he was all right, and he breathed and he said, "Yes, Shat Labim." And it was like he had, which means I'm very well. And I could understand, or I felt that he had gotten a major weight off of his shoulder. He was able to tell his story. And he did not die long after that. It was maybe just a few months after that that he passed away. And I feel possibly that he had, like I said, gotten the weight of the responsibility of sharing this story on video. Zorian did all of their oral history interviews on video, and then he passed away. So these are some of the stories that I cherish. One of the things that I did want to bring up was that, and this was forever, and perhaps still is, a dilemma with in these interviews, and that was that many or some eyewitnesses, genocide survivors, thought that the only reason we were there was to capture their experience during the deportation, or whatever was their experience during the genocide. And so some of them wanted to rush through the earlier questions, which was, where did you go to school, and you know, what kind of foods did you eat, and who cooked in your home, and what kind of songs did you sing? Did you go to church? Where did you go to church? And they wanted to kind of rush through that early part because they felt like they had to get to the climactic sort of episode in their life, which was the genocide. So we would work on that, and it was not always easy because sometimes after they told that story, they were done. They did not want to go back to discuss or talk about their earlier lives, and that was always the biggest dilemma in these oral history interviews, which was how do you get the full story of their lives from them, but also respect their wish to tell what they felt was the most important part of their life history. I was asked for a personal recollection, and earlier I mentioned Salpi Ghazarian's van. With Professor Hovannisian, we piled into his station wagon. He took us to Fresno. I do not remember how, I think it was a dozen of us, maybe it was 10 of us. We piled into 2 Hovannisian cars. One was a station wagon, because I rode in the station wagon, and the other one was another car, and both Professor Hovannisian and his wife, Dr. Richard Hovannisian, drove us to Fresno, where we spent the weekend interviewing genocide survivors. And it was a very interesting weekend, because I don't know how many of you could remember what life was like without, well, the students in the back don't know, but I don't know how many others of you can remember what life was like without cell phones. Well, we would be dropped off at someone's house, and we would interview them, then we would politely ask them to use their phone, which was usually a rotary dial phone, and then we would call Professor Hovannisian's mother's home and say, I'm done, I'm ready. And then we'd wait for somebody to pick us up. And sometimes it was a long wait because the cars might already be out taking somebody else or picking somebody else up. And so then sometimes the tape recorder would go back on and we'd get some more. And then sometimes it didn't. But anyway, that for me was one of my fondest recollections of that experience in Fresno. And it was, boy, the Fresno Armenians came from places like Chemishkazag and all kinds of unique names that we will soon, I guess, be reading about when my fellow board member Silva Karayan's husband's book is published. He's written a book with the names of 1,000 villages, 4,000 Armenian villages that are no longer in historic Armenia. I would like to conclude by saying that as a student, I didn't really understand the ramifications of what I was doing. I knew it was very, very important. I knew that we were recording history, and I also knew that in the scheme of things that it had to be important because of Professor Hovannisian, who was truly an inspiration to us all, a visionary, for recognizing the fact that these voices would one day expire, and before they did, these voices and the stories they had to tell should be recorded. And I'm very thankful for that experience, and it has been my honor to work for you. Thank you.